Hi, I'm Scott Faber with the Environmental Working Group, and thank you for joining us. The use of firefighting foam made with PFAS chemicals has contaminated the groundwater in hundreds of Department of Defense communities. And while the DoD helped create AFFF in the 1960s and knew that it was toxic by the early 1970s, the DoD has failed to clean up this legacy PFAS pollution. PFAS has been confirmed at more than 300 bases, and the PFAS detections at these bases are some of the highest ever found. But no one, perhaps besides a few DoD officials, knows how many, if any, of these bases have been cleaned up. What's more, hundreds more bases in neighboring communities are also likely contaminated with PFAS, but no one knows for sure. What we do know for sure is that PFAS has been linked to serious health problems, including cancer, harm to the reproductive system, and harm to the immune system. Tonight, we will hear directly from 5 leaders on the impacts of PFAS on their communities: Andrea Amico, Hope Gross, Ed Lawson, Tony Spaniola, and Joanne Stanton. After we hear from these leaders, we want to hear from you. So if you have questions, please add them to the comment section of your Facebook page. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea Amico.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Andrea Amico, and I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My PFAS story starts in May of 2014 when I read a newspaper article that changed my life. It was the Friday before Memorial Day, and I learned that high levels of PFCs, that's what we called PFAS at the time, were found in drinking water wells in my community. The 3 wells that were contaminated were located at the former Pease Air Force Base. In 1991, the base closed and was transformed into a large business complex we now know today as the Pease Trade Port. The article definitely caught my attention because my husband worked on the Pease Trade Port and my 2 young children attended daycare at a childcare center there. I had never heard of PFAS before, but my heart sank reading that a drinking water well had been shut down due to the high levels of contamination. I immediately started educating myself and asking questions of our state health department on the consequences of this exposure to my family, especially my young children who were exposed to highly contaminated drinking water at very young ages and at critical windows in their development. Sadly, I could not get any straight answers to what the short and long-term health effects may be for my family given this serious exposure. My quest for answers led me to form a community action group called Testing for Peas, and our work has led to many accomplishments in our community, such as a PFAS blood testing program, filtration of our drinking water, remediation of the contamination funded by the Air Force, and 2 PFAS health studies being offered to our community. My work as a PFAS advocate has also led me to develop strong relationships with my congressional delegation, testify in front of Congress, present at the CDC, and give a TEDx talk on my PFAS, on my story as a PFAS advocate. However, all the successes, once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and positive steps in the right direction in tackling PFAS at the local, state, and federal level can't undo the pain, anxiety, and anguish I live with every day, knowing my family was exposed to toxic forever chemicals in their drinking water. I often think back to when my husband and I first toured the daycare on the Pease Trade Port where we sent our children. It was in 2010, and I was pregnant with our first child. The daycare was a brand new facility, built from the ground up in the shape of a red schoolhouse. The floors were sparkling, the walls were covered in primary colors, and the classrooms were so inviting. My husband and I asked so many questions that day we toured about first aid certification, staffing ratios, curriculum. But we never questioned the quality of the water. So you can imagine the gut-wrenching pain I felt when I learned my children had been drinking highly contaminated water at a daycare for years. I can't even begin to put into words the immense amount of guilt I feel for putting my children in harm's way in a situation that was completely not my fault. I honestly lose sleep to this day worrying if tomorrow will be the day they get sick from this exposure, or if they will become sick in the future due to water they drank as babies and toddlers. And my story is not unique. Part of being an advocate in your community is that people trust you and seek you out to share their stories and ask questions. I've heard from numerous Tues community members, former service members, widows, firefighters, parents, and young adults, all sharing heartbreaking stories of battles with cancers, losing a spouse or loved one, struggles with infertility, and other disabling and serious health conditions. All of these people question if the high levels of PFAS at Tues was or is the root of their illness and loss. And as a member of the National PFAS Contamination Coalition, I have also heard from so many people, just like me, across the country facing PFAS contamination, many from DoD impacted sites, and hear their stories of illness, worry, and anger towards the lack of action to help them after they have been exposed. Sadly, PFAS contamination is not going away. We can't run out the clock and wait for everyone that's been exposed to pass away and do better next time. The harsh reality is these chemicals are forever. They build up in our bodies, water, food supplies, wildlife, and they are in the blood of more than 98% of Americans. They are also being passed to future generations through the placenta and breastfeeding. The layers of onion that is PFAS is just beginning to be pulled back. I can't undo what's happened to my family. My family are guinea pigs in an experiment that I didn't sign up for. We can't change the past, but we can learn from the past and do better to change the future. And we have to make sure that contamination on this scale never happens again moving forward. That starts with owning the problem, holding the polluters accountable, identifying solutions, and implementing swift and meaningful action to millions of Americans harmed by PFAS. I will continue to advocate for every American exposed to PFAS who have been poisoned without permission and contaminated out without consent, because the problem is not going away and we must do better moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And if you're just joining and have a question for any of our speakers, put your question in the comments. Gross.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, my name is Hope Gross, and I lived in Warminster in between two Superfund sites within 5 miles of each other. I'm also part of the National PFAS Contamination Coalition, and I'm also the co-founder of Bucksmont Coalition for Safer Water. I was born in Warminster, Pennsylvania in 1964, and for the first 25 years of my life, I lived directly across the street from the Warminster Navy base on Kirk Road. My home was adjacent to the base firefighting training area, where the firefighting foams containing PFAS were used and washed into the groundwater for over 50 years. We watched daily firefighting operations from my front porch. My family and many others had private well water. Public water was not available to homes surrounding the base until 1996. Other volatile organic chemicals and heavy metals were found at high levels, and the base was deemed a Superfund site. This was the first round of poisoning that we sustained. We didn't know about round 2 and PFAS until 18 years later. Our well was in our front lawn, 25 feet from the Navy's property and the firefighting training area. There was a creek running alongside our home that gathered runoff from the base. In the creek was a large pipe big enough for us to walk through as children that ran from the Navy's property under the gravel street to our property and our well. We not only drank contaminated well water, we brushed our teeth in it, we swam in it in our pool, we showered in it. And the most sickening was my mother fed us baby formula mixed with this toxic water as infants. I was one of 6 children in my family being poisoned unknowingly. My neighborhood well, once hooked up to public water, following the base's designation on the Superfund National Priority List, was well 26. Now the most polluted well in town, with PFAS levels recorded at 1,200 parts per trillion in 2014, following the first EPA UCMR testing. Today, this well still remains shut down, still testing at 1,200 parts per trillion due to its proximity to a large uncontained PFAS plume from the former base. Per USA Today, my family's drinking water well remains one of the highest PFAS levels found from a public drinking water well in the country. It's ironic to think that we got hooked up to safer water because of VOCs and heavy metals threatening our health. Little did we know, the poison continued, and VOCs would be the least of our worries. Growing up, all 8 of my family pets had cancerous tumors and died. Then in 1990, my father died from cancer at 52. It wasn't just my family. So many other neighbors passed from cancer and other debilitating diseases well before their time. 3 months after burying my father at age 25, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, which for me had been a lifelong sentence. During my treatments for one cancer, doctors repeatedly found and removed other rare tumors from my body. My sister has endured serious health and autoimmune issues, including ovarian cysts, lupus, fibromyalgia, abdominal aortic vertebrae aneurysms. I lived in my family home until 1989. I also worked at the Navy base during my college years and after college for a year or so. Here, other civilian workers and I, as well as their own dedicated military, drank the highly contaminated water on a daily basis. I then moved to Horsham, across the street from the Horsham Navy base, until 1992, and spent more time drinking from well 26, how ironic, the same number, was one of the most polluted PFAS wells in Horsham. The military is one of the biggest polluters in our country. Not only did they bury toxic waste routinely, lit jet fuel on fire and put it out with AFFF, firefighting foam. They also burned a toxic soup in burn pits that polluted the well water on the base and surrounding neighborhood private wells and municipal wells. There were over 50 other chemicals listed in CERCLA the CERCLA list before we even knew about PFAS. I have been dealt a lifelong cancer sentence. Anytime something is wrong with my health, I just about anything, I immediately get filled with crippling fear that it's cancer. I have lived 25 years with a fear about what my exposures to these chemicals have done to my body, all because my parents bought a home adjacent to the Warminster Navy base. This type of trauma doesn't fade away. I have spent an exuberant amount of time, money, dealing with this health issues, out-of-pocket expenses. I lost count years ago, and psychological scars that cannot be measured. Loss of work, loss of family time, loss of my loved ones. These things I lost cannot be given back to me. The worst part of my deep-rooted fear is when it turns to guilt about what I may have exposed my children to through second-generation health effects from PFAS and other chemical exposures. PFAS were passed on to my 2 daughters through my umbilical cord and my breast milk. What should have been nourishment for my unborn babies was in fact poison, a poison we are just beginning to learn about. Do you know what kind of knowledge, what that kind of knowledge does to me as a mother, knowing that I could have poisoned my own children? Our family has suffered lifelong devastation. We are not alone. There are tens of thousands of others in our town that have possibly suffered some of the same devastation from PFAS exposure. I was once an innocent child who trusted that my parents, my family, my neighborhood, and my government would protect me and keep me safe. Thanks to the military, I stand before you today as an adult, and every day is a battle for me to trust anyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Hope. Our next speaker will be Ed Lawson.
Good evening, everyone. Um, I too share the first two speakers' concern, and I want to first say that my name is Ed Lawson, and I lead and I'm the co-chair for the Newburgh Stewart Air National Guard Restoration Advisory Committee. And in that role, I'm very humbled and I'm very honored to be able to speak for that community, for these communities, the communities of Newburgh, the city, the town of Newburgh, and the town of New Windsor. And it's in that capacity, I just wanted to begin by reflecting on an African proverb that speaks to this issue. And it says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So I want to begin right there by acknowledging some of the great community team members that we have. As a part of the RAC, we are privileged to be able to have 5 community groups, and I want to just highlight them because their work is important to how we're going to resolve this situation. I know it's a terrible situation, and we have heartache stories as well. Um, but really, my purpose and goal in being involved in this is to make a difference and to change so that again, as one of the speakers already said, that this doesn't happen anymore. If we continue down the path of just sort of checking boxes and going through the motions without being intentional and purposeful about how we actually solve these issues and remedy these problems, they'll repeat themselves. So again, I want to give honor and homage to Hudson River Sloop Clearwater as one of our partners, the Newburgh Clean Water Project as one of our partners, the Newburgh Conservation Advisory Council, Quassack Creek Watershed Alliance, and Riverkeeper, who serve very valiantly on our RAC and provide us with insight that, quite frankly, um, we don't have as community members, and we thank them as well. I would also like to thank all of the RAC members. I'm not going to name all of them but they know who they are, and they have been committed to this work of us trying to ensure that the people and the communities of Newburgh have voice, and that voice is validated and valued as it relates to the environmental justice that we're entitled to and deserve. So just to give you a little background about Newburgh, we at one time, the city of Newburgh, had a robust and viable water system developed in the late 19th century that predates by almost 550 years the vaunted New York City water supply system. And is now that system is completely incapacitated or has been completely incapacitated by PFAS and PFAS contamination. The ranking of our and other impacted systems are being determined through the relative risk site evaluation process, which some of you may be familiar with. And given the vulnerable population that we find ourselves in the city of Newburgh, um, there's an environmental and social justice issues that are impacted um, by the population in the city of Newburgh. And we are concerned about how we advance Newburgh from the now several years long testing process to clean up. Again, I'm more about results. I'm more about resolution. Um, I, I, I want to try to figure out how we get this done so that no more people suffer, no more people die. As one of the speakers already suggested, these are forever chemicals. So we want to forever eliminate them so that they don't impact future generations. And that takes us being intentional and us engaging in work right now. Um, the appropriate vehicle for us to really make this remedy happen is to address the toxic PFAS pollution through the annual National Defense Authorization Act and the annual defense appropriation bills. And in addition to that, I think the other place that we can make impact and make transformative change is by engaging in understanding this problem, by studying this problem. We in Newburgh are fortunate because we are a part of a PFAS multi-site study um, as part of the University of Albany and the New York State Department of Health, who receive federal funding to study PFAS and the possible health effects from drinking PFAS contaminated water in Newburgh and Hoosick Falls. We're extremely excited about this opportunity to partner with the University of Albany, and our principal investigator is Dr. Erin Bell. She's a superstar. One of the things that has happened is that they have really embraced this notion of community, and that this work is going to be done collaboratively. This work has to be done by engaging the community, not by coming in and just testing and not understanding the depth and the breadth of the community that we're actually studying. And so they have taken this task on full steam and full bore, and we're excited about what we're going to be able to accomplish with them. Newburgh, as I mentioned, is one of 2 contaminated communities in New York that has been chosen for this national study. Hoosick Falls is the other one. This funding is through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry. New York's effort is led by researchers from the New York State Department of Health, as I mentioned, and both communities, Hoosick Falls and Newburgh, will be integral in trying to figure out what happens. Blood tests, urine samples, neurobehavioral tests in children, and medical histories will be a part of what's going on. For 3 years, they will embed themselves in our community and be our neighbors and understand what it is and how we work and how we live, and study the impact of PFAS at a real level. This new study is important because it includes communities with exposure to PFAS resulting from the use of AAFF. And by the way, all of these acronyms are really annoying, but we have to do them. AAF, PFOA, and other PFAS. The health outcomes that will be evaluated in the study were selected based on the results of previous animal and etymological studies, and include biomarkers such as levels of cholesterol, liver enzymes, thyroid and kidney function, and child neural development, infant birth weight, and risk of kidney and testicular cancer. Was really mind-boggling as everyone was talking about the issues and the impact of PFAS, is that we still don't know what the impact is. And this study is way far overdue. In fact, in a second, I'm going to share a story of a tragedy that we had in Newburgh by one of our own moms, Cynthia Mack, who's also on our RAC committee, whose son tragically passed away from a mysterious cancer that he received because they lived near one of the contaminated water thoroughfares. But what again, my focus as co-chair of the RAC and as sort of the resident leader in this particular community is to help to be about the solution and to hold people accountable to it, what we're trying to do. One of the other things I would mention is that Dr. Bell, as I mentioned, is a superstar. She is a part of the National Academy of Medicine, and they have convened a committee to provide guidance to the funders of this PFAS training and testing. So we are in a unique position in Newburgh to first get real-time information about the impacts of PFAS, and then to use that information to inform our RAC process about how remediation is important. Lastly, I'll say this, as some of the other speakers has already mentioned, I think that one of the only ways that this gets done is through effective implementation that is seen through something that I call TSA. There's a need to be transparent. DOD needs to be transparent. Stewart Air National Guard needs to be transparent. They need to be willing to share data and willing to share information and on a real-time basis and let it go where it goes. Whatever the issues are, we need to know completely, not just a test here or a test there. We want to know completely that there is, wherever PFAS and PFOA is, the multiple layers of PFAS, because there are different types of PFAS and PFOA. We want to have a full-fledged study, not a study that just checks the box and leaves us with lack of information. Whether it's good news or bad news, we want the process to be transparent. Secondly, we're guided by standards. There should be clear evidence-based procedures and standards that guide our behavior and practice of how we remediate this. For example, we want to know not just one thoroughfare, we want to know all thoroughfares of how water and how soil and how other issues can be contaminating our water flow, not just the in Newburgh, the Washington Lake. We want to know how it is contaminating wells in our communities. And then finally, we want to hold people accountable. There should be practices and policies that after we find out, because of transparency, what's going on, and after we hold people to evidence-based standards, that we now get the funding that we need to remediate how we need to remediate. So with that said, I thank you for hosting this, the environmental water, for hosting this opportunity to share for all of these communities. And I really want to advocate for all of our communities using this opportunity to not just point out the issues and the errors and the challenges, but also really hold the DOD to task to find solutions, to find money, so that we can remedy these situations in a real and mighty way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And for those of you who are just tuning in, if you have questions for any of our speakers, put them in the comment section of your Facebook page and we'll get them to at the end. Our next speaker is Tony Spaniola.
Thanks, Scott. My name is Tony Spaniola. I'm a member of the Need Our Water Community Action Group and the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. My wife and I own a home on a lake in the small northern Michigan town of Oscoda. We are surrounded by the splendor of the Huron National Forest, beautiful inland waterways, Lake Huron, and spectacular wildlife, including a family of bald eagles that often lunches in our backyard. Our town is also the home of the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base, a strategic air command facility that closed in 1993. In 2010, the former base became the first U.S. military installation in the world at which PFAS contamination was publicly reported. 11 years later, the Air Force still has no plan to clean it up. Because of the PFAS contamination, the state of Michigan advised my family, like many others in our town, not to drink the water from our residential well. The Air Force has done nothing to address our problem. The state has also advised my family and our community to avoid all contact with highly contaminated surface water foam like that in the background behind me. This foam lines the shorelines in our town and is deposited during high waters in my family's backyard. The Air Force has disregarded the state's health warnings and even claimed at one point that the foam is nothing more than washing machine detergent. With PFAS levels as high as 165,000 parts per trillion and a chemical signature that matches the PFAS firefighting foam used by the Air Force, this foam is a graphic testament to the Air Force's gross misconduct in my community. Unfortunately, there's much more to the story. In our region, fishing and hunting are critical components of an economy that relies heavily on tourism, and they are a life-sustaining source of food for the many living in poverty who cannot afford to buy groceries. Under 3 additional public health warnings from the state of Michigan, it is unsafe to consume venison, all forms of small game and semi-aquatic wildlife, and any non-migratory fish in areas that stretch for miles around the former base. These fish are some of the most highly contaminated fish in the world. In 2012, the state scientists warned that residents who consume these fish are likely to have dangerously high levels of PFAS in their blood. 9 years later, the Air Force has done nothing to find or attempt to assist those residents. And the Air Force continues to contaminate the areas in question every minute of every hour of every day. For military personnel and their families who served and lived at the base, the perils are even greater. A scientific study of on-base drinking water, preserved from the period of the base's operations, shows that those individuals drank levels of PFAS from which they were given no protection. Despite their serious and debilitating illnesses, the Air Force has left them to twist in the wind. So we have 5 separate public health warnings, health impacted residents and veterans, massive and widespread contamination, and there's still no plan in place after 11 years. That hasn't happened by accident. The Air Force has done everything in its power to minimize, deny, and delay. It has lied, it has threatened, it has destroyed documents, and it has broken the law. The Air Force runs its PFAS program at Wordsmith like a third world dictatorship. All decisions are made in secret. Any attempts to hold the Air Force accountable are met with stonewalling, intimidation, and retribution. For example, upon learning that the Air Force had destroyed pertinent documents, a local official asked the Air Force for an explanation at a base closure team meeting. In response, the Air Force banned that local official and every other local official in the community from ever attending a base closure team meeting again. The military has improperly threatened to withhold or delay federal cleanup grant monies as a means to gain leverage with Michigan regulators. It refused for many years to utilize or even recognize PFAS sampling data compiled by Michigan regulators. And it has lied on its own data maps about the size and location of PFAS plumes at and around the base. The truth is that my community is paying the price for being the first military PFAS site in the world. As the Air Force says, anything it does in Oscoda will set a precedent for the hundreds of other military sites for which it's responsible. In reality, the precedent set by the Air Force in Oscoda is disgraceful and scandalous. It has abused the public trust and left a trail of deception, harm, and destruction. President Biden and Secretary Austin, my community needs you to clean house and to clean up this mess. Members of Congress, we need you to bring a day of reckoning and to pursue vigorous oversight to end these terrible abuses, which are not limited to my community. There's no defense for the Air Force's conduct in Oscoda. There's no defense for its lack of leadership and proper conduct around the country. It's time to bring that to an end now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the comment section. We'll get to them after our next speaker, who's Joanne Stanton. Joanne, you're on mute.
Okay, there we go. Good evening. My name is Joanne Stanton, and like Hope Gross, who you heard from earlier, I co-founded the Bucksmont Coalition for Safer Water, and I am part of the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. I grew up in Warminster, Pennsylvania, about 2 miles from 2 separate military bases in Warminster and Horsham, both EPA Superfund sites that used AFFF firefighting foam. 7 years ago, our community was devastated to discover the drinking water of over 80,000 residents had been grossly contaminated with PFAS for over 50 years, my entire childhood growing up. And my story really starts at motherhood. And I will have to say, I was very naive as a young mother. I thought for sure if a product was on a store shelf, it was tested and proven safe. If water came out of my kitchen faucet, it was safe. I had no idea how weak our chemical laws were and just how many untested and unregulated chemicals like PFAS can easily make their way into our drinking water. I learned the hard way just how important our environmental laws are in safeguarding our health, especially the health of our children. When I began researching and reading about the health effects of PFAS, I learned that some of these chemicals can cause the placenta and affect a developing fetus. Animal studies show it cause tumors, cancer, neurodevelopmental problems, and even second-generation health effects. And as I was reading, the magnitude of what I was learning really hit me like a ton of bricks. And my mind immediately raced back to when my oldest son was diagnosed with a cancerous brain tumor at age 6. Following surgery, epidemiologists came into our hospital room and they began pummeling my husband and I with very pointed questions. Where do you live? Where was your early pregnancy? Have you or your husband ever worked with chemicals or pesticides? At that moment, we were told that they had found embryonic tissue in the center of my son's cancerous tumor, which meant that it started to form during his brain development during my pregnancy. Now, shortly after my son was diagnosed with a brain tumor, one of my childhood friends who lived just a few houses away learned that her 3-year-old son had a brain tumor. 5 years after that, another childhood friend directly across the street had a son diagnosed with a brain tumor. All the tumors were cancerous, and every tumor had embryonic tissue at the core. Was it a coincidence that 3 of us growing up together with tumors? Well, doctors at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where all 3 were treated, thought that was much more than coincidental. Now, I came full circle to know that I unknowingly drank PFAS contaminated water throughout my entire childhood, into my early adult years, and during my pregnancy. I believe that these chemicals played a role in my son's cancer and in all the other cancers and chronic health problems reported by so many people in our community over the past few decades. As a mother, it was gut-wrenching to comprehend that my exposure to PFAS may have caused my son's cancer and his subsequent disabilities that he still lives with. But it was far more sickening to learn that the military knew for decades about the dangers of PFAS and continued to use it, while unsuspecting families in nearby communities and their own military drank toxic water. Many left sickened with disease, and many more that died prematurely. It has been 7 years since the military first discovered widespread PFAS contamination at our bases in Bucks and Montgomery counties in Pennsylvania. But the chemicals are still polluting the aquifer and waterways like Park Creek and Little Neshaminy Creek. Why? How can this continue? I just keep asking myself. DoD action has been far too slow and far too inadequate. The DoD has freely admitted that toxic firefighting chemicals poured off the base in Horsham and into surrounding waterways at levels up to 4,000 times what the EPA health advisory now is. Yet no one has the power to hold them accountable. How can this be? Like so many DoD sites across the country, locally, we have large uncontained plumes still looming underground. You heard this from almost all of the speakers. So PFAS remains a public health threat to our local water sources, including thousands of area residents with private wells that in our state of Pennsylvania, we have 0 regulations for private well owners, no advisories that have to be followed. We still have local residents worrying if they or their children will suffer serious medical problems later in life or now due to the extent and to the duration of their exposure to PFAS. You've heard it, and you're going to hear it again and again. The DoD is one of the largest polluters in our country. And I find it so ironic that the very entity whose job it is to protect the American people ended up giving a lot of American people cancer and other devastating diseases due to the way they handled toxic chemicals. Consider this. If a foreign entity came in and contaminated US drinking water sources to the extent the DoD has with PFAS, we would likely have mobilized our military forces against them. We need to make sure PFAS contamination at DoD sites is cleaned up, and to ensure what happened to communities like mine and the other speakers don't happen again. That's it. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for listening.
Thank you, Hope. And we have a lot of questions. If you're watching and you do have a question, just put it in the comment section. One question we've gotten for you, Joanne and Hope, is what is DoD telling you when you ask them to clean up these plumes coming off the bases? What story, what explanation are they giving you?
I'll go first, and then I guess Hope can take it from there. I mean, nothing. They just keep stumbling, and it's delay tactics, and they're studying the problem. They have been studying the problem for 7 years, and I feel bad because Tony said it's been 11 where he is, so we don't win that one. But it is so frustrating to go to these meetings, these RAB meetings, and just hear delay tactics, delay tactics. We have to study, we have to study, we have to study. They have to stop being, they're just reactive. Everything is reactive instead of being proactive. Hope.
And I just want to add that Joanne's completely right. We go to these meetings and ask questions that are stonewalled, like we heard earlier. And, you know, we can drive by, Joanne and I have videoed how they have said they're stopping it from getting into the community, this invisible fence that surrounds the bases, but they have it with boards nailed to a pipe, and then the water's just flowing out into the neighborhood. So they don't have, I don't think, a good enough plan. And they're not keeping the communities clean or safe. They're polluting across that invisible fence, and they only want to talk about how they're containing it within their walls, which is not really fair to the local communities that they're polluting.
Let me just add, I think Tony said it best when he said, minimize, deny, and delay. That is like the motto.
You know, there are a lot of folks who are near bases with contamination who may be watching this Facebook Live who've not really begun to, they're not on a RAC or RAB. They may not have interacted with their local officials. Maybe ask Tony and Ed to answer this question. What would you tell people who are watching who have just discovered, as people who live near Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, that their wells are contaminated? After 11 years, Tony, what have you learned? How would you advise them to interact with the local officials?
Well, I would first of all tell them, and what we found in Oscoda was to come together with your neighbors and to speak as a group and in a unified way. And then I think secondly, to reach out to your members of Congress, your US senators and your Congress people. In our experience, really the only people who the DoD pays any attention to are the members of Congress who control their funding and their oversight. Local officials, it's important that the local community come together. It's important that you organize. It's important that you reach out. But I really think it's important that you work closely with your members of Congress, your state legislators, really anybody who will speak up on behalf of the community. And the other thing that I would say is try to make contact with your local media, because there's so much of this, the stonewalling and some of the things that the DoD people say are so incredibly ridiculous that simply shining a light and getting the stories out in public are ways to have them, be held accountable. I'll just give one quick example. You can see it, we're on a lake, and the question to Joanne and Hope, the contamination comes off the base towards the lake. And for years, the Air Force said that it came to the lake and stopped and never entered the lake, which is impossible. It's ridiculous. That story finally got out, and so now they're admitting that that's happening. But seriously, I think it's really important to reach out to your members of Congress.
And maybe ask Ed to answer that as well.
Yeah, so I think Tony nailed it, right? As far as the collaboration and the community, where there's people, there is power. And I think that's right. I think mobilizing the folks, helping them to understand what the issue is, and helping them to be able to reach out to their representatives to get action done. I just want to share a story as well. So one of the goals of our RAC is to promote awareness and understanding of the technical and regulatory issues that are involved. But the city of Newburgh, we have over 65% of the population is Spanish speaking. And so we asked them to translate or transcreate some of the information in that language. And their response was, we don't have money. We can't do that. So it's kind of in that vein that Tony was just speaking about. We have this RAC, and one of the goals pronounced in the RAC is that we get information to people so that they can be aware and advocate for themselves. But part of being able to advocate for yourself is to understand exactly what's going on, and to not be able to translate is a problem. But then so I want to bring in, I mentioned to you about University of Albany and a study. So one of the things that now, because they have this funding and they're doing this study, that they're going to do is to translate that material for us. So you got to engage the people, and you got to be strategic and intentionally and purposeful, because we can't expect, in the Art of War, Sun Tzu says, I'm paraphrasing something he says, to be victorious in 1,000 battles, you have to know who you are and you have to know your enemy. So it's clear that our enemy is not going to play fair. So it's important that we understand how to navigate the rules of engagement to get this information out. And the last thing I'm just going to say, we need to understand this process better. I'm learning as it's like we're building the plane, flying the plane as we're building it, and that's difficult. So it's not as easy. And so the question is deeper than just what do you do? It's how do you do it, and that's important too. So one of the things that we think is important is gathering information to demystify the process. And I know a lot of the work that everyone's on the call doing, they share that information. So I think the communities are coming together, and I think that's helpful as well.
One question we're getting from our Facebook audience is to what extent does DoD have to meet EPA standards or state standards? I know that's been an issue in both Michigan and New Hampshire. So maybe I can ask Andrea and Tony to talk about that. Andrea, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that question. So, yeah, right now, unfortunately, the EPA does not have any enforceable standards for PFAS. So they have lifetime health advisories, and that's exactly what they are, advisories. And that's created a huge problem. I mean, that's exactly what I thought of when Hope and Joanne were saying, they can't hold DoD accountable. We don't have anything enforceable to hold them accountable. So right now, DoD has, the best of my knowledge, been adhering to the 70 part per trillion for PFOS and PFOA, which is the EPA. Go ahead and create their own enforceable standards for PFAS. So in New Hampshire, back in 2019, the state of New Hampshire set MCLs for 4 different PFAS that were much lower than the EPA's advisories. And there are some private wells surrounding the former Pease Air Force Base in the town of Newington, New Hampshire. And some of those wells have been contaminated with PFAS levels above the 70 parts per trillion of the EPA health advisory, and DoD has stepped in and remedied that situation for those private well owners. However, once New Hampshire set their MCLs for 4 different PFAS, there were 5 homes, that private wells, that were below the EPA 70 parts per trillion, but above the New Hampshire MCLs, and the DoD has refused to take action in those homes. And frankly, that's just completely unacceptable to me. It's unacceptable to me that the EPA has not done enough to help people like us. This isn't 1 or 2 communities. This is hundreds of communities, millions of Americans across the country facing this issue, and EPA has not done enough to step in and help us. So in the absence of that, our states are doing that, and they're struggling. It's hard. And then the polluter, DoD, can come in and not adhere to those standards, the state standards that New Hampshire based in science and based on protecting the most vulnerable population, and DoD can just choose not to adhere to state laws. I think it's incredibly wrong. And we have absolutely experienced that in New Hampshire. And to this date, DoD will not take action on anything below 70 parts per trillion. And it's completely wrong. And that's why we need a federal standard. That's why we need EPA to regulate PFAS. I'd love to see it regulated as a class and as far down as 1 part per trillion. I think that's the most protective. So, thanks.
Tony?
Yeah, I will add, in Michigan, we actually have had a groundwater regulation, a surface water regulation in effect since 2014. And so we've been the Air Force has been horsing us around for 7 years on that whole state law compliance issue. But as a lawyer, I would kind of approach this in 2 different buckets. One is the state law version and one is the federal. And we've done a lot of looking at this, both myself and lawyers that I've worked with. And first off, for all you communities out there around the country where your states are adopting standards, DoD may very well say to you, we will comply with those. They did that with us in Oscoda, and as soon as it came time to have to comply, they cut and ran. And then are still refusing to comply with the Michigan standards, which have been added to over the course of the last year. Every excuse under this, including for ludicrous statement that they to the compliance with the state standards, saying that they have to operate under CERCLA. We've gotten research from the National Wildlife Federation that said that sovereign immunity defense is bogus, but to get them to comply has been another story. The other piece on the federal level, under CERCLA, CERCLA does regulate, I believe they're called contaminants and pollutants. And PFAS, the PFOA and PFOS, the two that are most commonly referred to, are contaminants and pollutants. But what the Air Force has done under CERCLA, if there is an imminent and substantial threat to human health or the environment, then they're supposed to take action right away. Well, as I mentioned before, we have 5 of those in Oscoda, and they've ignored pretty much every single one of them. So there are some laws on the books. Very difficult to sue the Department of Defense. There are all sorts of special defenses, and judges tend to be very deferential to them. So it's a tough road, and we really need the federal government from the top down to start cleaning house, both from a regulatory standpoint, and also DOD just needs to start protecting public health. There's just common sense things that need to be done, and they just have no desire to do that at all.
Well, that's a great place to stop. And before we let you go, we wanted to show a trailer from a documentary that's coming out soon called No Defense. And our expert IT folks will turn that on now. Before you do that, so I want to say thank you to all of our community leaders for sharing your stories, and thank you to our Facebook audience for joining us. And now we'll see a trailer for a documentary that's coming out soon near you.
You can imagine a bunch of 21-year-old guys with foam to pull a chute around. It was probably a lot of fun.
Camera flash, a lightning bolt flash, anything like that could immediately set the system off. So you would have thousands of gallons of this stuff spread out through the hangar.
It filled the hangar, so I had to basically crawl out through the amount of foam.
They would train 2 or 3 times a week at Wordsmith. They would actually foam on the runway. The soldiers would wash, and fire departments would wash their cars with it.
I've heard stories that the Air Force used to call it Laundry Day.
They'd have parties. They'd play in it. Bring the kids.
And then where did the foam go?
Into the ground.
Then they would just sweep it down the drains.
With like
little squeegees, and then wash down the floor, and that was the end of it, because we all thought that this was okay stuff.
My name is David Parks, and I was born at Francis C. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming. After research, I realized I've been exposed to PFAS pretty much since the day I was born. There is now undeniable proof that the Air Force knew of this and tried to mask the truth of what was going on, and continued to allow the contamination for many years after its discovery. It's like a prison sentence, and I can't even describe it adequately. Without someone living it, I don't think they could understand.